It's a question from Tom in London. He asks, why is Andy Burnham not in more hot water over scandals and failings at Greater Manchester Police?
Okay, this is a really important question. I'm glad that Tom sent it in. 3 women have made claims about Greater Manchester Police, with one saying she was drugged and sexually assaulted during her detention by the police in 2021. There are 2 hours of footage that have gone missing from the period of detention. And the force has denied withholding that footage. And Andy Burnham, as Greater Manchester Mayor, he is the police commissioner for this force. He's ordered a review of these cases. I think this is a really important story, not just because of the allegations at hand, but because of the way that we see our police forces are run. So who do we think is head of Manchester Police? Do we see it as Andy Burnham, or do we see it as the police chief? In the struggles of the Met, Sadiq Khan has often come under pressure, and you can see it in London campaigns. Often his Conservative and other opponents will sort of pin any problems with crime and any problems within the police force on his mayoralty, because he is, again, as mayor, the commissioner. Is there a problem with the lines of accountability here in terms of our police?
Yeah, I think there are. I think it's slightly confused. If you look at Sadiq Khan, it's often he and the Home Secretary are pointing at each other going, it's your fault and it's not my fault. In part, that's a symptom of the Met Police having national responsibilities, the counter-terrorism and things like that, alongside policing London itself. But it is an interesting question. I think it's a great question. I think just mentioning Sadiq Khan, as we both have done, immediately just highlights how often the media just focus on the Met. I think it's because we're all in London, but then also because it's also the national functions that they also hold. But, you know, Manchester is the second biggest police force in the country, I think, and they've had a series of problems. They went into special measures, I think it was back in 2020, after they didn't record 1 in 5 crimes for a period of a year. So there was a number of failings that they were put in special measures for, and then they did improve. They did get taken out of special measures back in October 2022, and they recovered a large number of metrics, including response times and things like that, quite quickly. But in terms of accountability, I think it's super interesting. Police and crime commissioners, they were brought in 2011 by the coalition government, and the idea was that you'd have this elected person who was responsible for the police. What does that mean? It means that they appoint the chief constable. It means they're responsible for their budget. It also means that they set their overall policing strategy. You know, what sort of crime do you want to focus on? Where do you want to put the money? And the idea, was to give the public a lever to pull to influence how that area was policed. But we've not really seen that. And I think one of the problems is that we've had such a low turnout for all of these police and crime commissioner elections. Often it's around 15%. So it's very hard to say that the electorate or constituents are holding the police and crime commissioner and indirectly the police to account if no one's actually voting in those elections. So what you've seen since then, and since around 2013 onwards, when we had all the discussions about metro mayors, is that the police and crime commissioners have been subsumed into the metro mayoralties. So Andy Burnham effectively has that role now as part of his role as Manchester mayor. So I think there is a slight confusion. Andy Burnham can call for a review, and he can try and hold the chief constable to account, because he can ultimately get rid of them. But it's really tricky, and I think the devolved administrations do it in different ways, and I don't think anyone would admit that it's gone particularly well in the past 10 years.
Yeah, I do think this is a sort of wider lesson about devolution in general, which is, both main parties want to devolve more power. They kind of talk about it as this catch-all solution to local problems. But actually, you do get a too many cooks situation. I mean, the policing example is a perfect example of that. You have the Home Secretary, you have the mayor in some places, you have the police and crime commissioner in the places without metro mayoralties, you have the police chief themselves. And, in the end, it means that a lot of people can point the blame at other people, and actually, what's right for victims falls through all of these stalls. I remember speaking to Ian Blair, who was Met Commissioner in the new Labour years, and he said that he felt like that play one man, two governors, because he had the Home Secretary on one side and he had the London Mayor on the other side, and they were often trying to take credit for the things that the Met were doing well and blame each other for the failings. And I think we've seen a lot of that with the situation of Sadiq Khan in London. And actually, I mean, these police and crime commissioners, who, according to the people that I've spoken to when I've been reporting on the police, have taken away some of that accountability because you don't get as many police chiefs on the airwaves, on media doing interviews, taking responsibility for their force's mistakes as you used to, because you now have this extra layer and it's basically like an evasive politician being interviewed again, rather than someone who actually knows what's going on in their force on the ground. That apparently has been a big change over the past decade of having these PCCs in. And actually Labour has toyed with getting rid of this system over the years as well.
And as we discussed back in Crime Week, I can't remember when it was, but it was Labour's
Every week is Crime Week in Britain.
One of their key things is they want to regulate the system by which police forces are held to account. At the moment, Labour is complaining about the fact that individual police forces have individual standards, and they want to standardise all of that so we get a greater understanding of what the police forces are up to. So they're very aware of it, and I think Yvette Cooper's team and Labour in general are definitely looking at police forces and how they're regulated and how we hold them to accountable quite closely.
I think that's really important, because if you look at the case of these 3 women who were strip searched, this was in 2021. This was in the period of special measures. Special measures is supposed to be a period of heightened scrutiny. So, we don't know what's happened in this case, but when we do know the details, there may be questions to be answered on why this wasn't picked up at the time. But Ben, can you give us a bit of an idea, because we've been talking about PCCs, Freddie mentioned the low turnout. How much voter engagement is there really with these elections, and has it sort of waxed and waned over the years since they were introduced?
Yeah, so they were introduced back in 2012. First election for them was in the middle of November 2012, and the turnout back then was around about 15% or so, which was astonishing. It was ridiculously low. That's lower than anything we normally get in local elections. And then we fast forwarded to 2016, and turnout decided to start to rise. And I don't want to say voters got normalised to the idea of voting in PCC elections, but more people were engaging with them. So we went up from an average of about 15 to 20% to around about 25% in 2016. In the PCC elections, it was getting closer to 30%, 25 to 30%. So we are seeing greater engagement in it. Now, bear in mind, in local council elections, turnout is normally around about 35%. So a PCC vote, hovering around 30, that's still subpar for our standard engagements with local contests, I suppose. And Andy Burnham, when he's first stood for the Greater Manchester mayoralty, won very convincingly, more than Labour normally ever wins in Greater Manchester, but only on a turnout of 29%. In 2021, it was a turnout of 35%. So you can see a big increase, despite, by the way, 2021 was held in the immediate aftermath of lockdown. So I think over time institutions do get normalised to voters. We do tend to vote in what we've known has existed for however long, and we are seeing that in mayoralties. We are slowly seeing that with PCC votes, though I still, for the life of me, can't understand why we have them. In the case of Burnham, and I wonder why he's not getting enough flack or as much stick as perhaps he should. Let's say if it was, Sadiq Khan down in London or in Scotland. I think it comes down to the fact that, well, we can't measure the public attention on it, although we could try to. But is Burnham being associated with it in the eyes of the public? We don't really know. And I'm minded to suspect no. And I just want to give a little example here. So 2020, lockdown, first one. We were freed for a little while in July, in the summer months, I suppose. And across the whole of the UK, lockdown laws were pretty much the same until we moved to that tier system, if you remember that horrid tier system. And in that period of time, Boris Johnson saw his numbers rise and plateau quite a little bit. And I always remember this, in Scotland, if you asked Scots, who do you think is handling COVID well? Very few Scots said Boris Johnson. But lots of Scots obviously said Nicola Sturgeon. And it's worth bearing in mind, at that time when that poll was asked, there was no difference in policy between Sturgeon and Johnson. It was all about your own personal prejudice. Let's not beat around the bush. Voters are prejudiced. If Sturgeon does the same thing as Johnson does, I'll say Sturgeon did it brilliantly and Johnson did it terribly. A lot of voters are willing to do that. They're very much like that. And I suspect maybe if we were to measure the public opinion element of this in Greater Manchester with relation to Mr. Burnham, I suspect, one, voters aren't clued up enough to know it falls under Burnham's purview. And two, I don't think voters will necessarily care because they probably view it's a nationwide institutional problem that needs to be sorted down in Westminster. I just don't think voters associate the bad things with their local leaders as much as they do with Westminster. Although bear in mind, the third most unpopular tax in the country is council tax. So actually, I do think if you're looking to bash a local politician, it will obviously be a local council. But a local mayor, not always.
Yeah, that's another layer that I forgot to mention, is the local council separate from the mayor's office. Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.